In a small Texas town, a dark secret lay hidden within a seemingly ordinary family. A devoted wife uncovers a chilling affair between her husband and his half-sister, igniting a chain of events that leads to betrayal, murder, and a trial that stuns the community. This is the haunting story of love, lies, and the devastating consequences of forbidden desires. It was 2006, a quiet summer in rural Texas. The Wallace family home sat at the end of a dirt road lined with towering oak trees. The house was modest, but warm, with pale blue shutters and a wraparound porch, where Susan often sat in the evenings sipping iced tea while their children played in the yard. From the outside, everything about the Wallace family seemed picture-perfect. Rachel Thompson, 35, was the heart of the household, a devoted homemaker who found joy in small everyday things, baking pies for the church fundraiser, sewing her children's clothes, and keeping the house spotless. She had a nurturing nature, always putting others before herself. Growing up in a strict but loving household, she learned the value of commitment and hard work from her parents. Her marriage to David Thompson was her pride, and she believed they had built a strong, unshakable foundation. David Thompson, 40, was the breadwinner of the family. A skilled mechanic, he worked long hours at the local repair shop. He was quiet, dependable, and seemed to share the same family values as Susan. To the outside world, David Thompson was a man devoted to his family, but David's past was more complicated than anyone, including Susan, truly understood. David had grown up in the shadow of his father's infidelity. His father, a man with a wandering eye, had a brief affair that resulted in the birth of a child, Emma Parker. Emma's existence was whispered about in the small Texas town, but was largely ignored by David's family. David's mother, a proud and stoic woman, refused to acknowledge the affair or the child it produced. Emma and her mother moved to another town, and for years David had no contact with her. Everything changed when David turned 17. Emma's mother brought her to David's town, and the two half-siblings met for the first time. Emma, just 15 then, was bold and rebellious, the polar opposite of David's quiet, disciplined demeanor. The connection they formed was immediate, but far from ordinary. Emma was drawn to David's steadiness, and David, who had grown up yearning for a deeper bond in his fractured family, found himself captivated by her wild energy. What began as an innocent sibling bond took a darker turn as they grew older. By the time David was 19, their relationship had crossed boundaries that should have remained untouched. It was a secret they both carried into adulthood, unspoken but never forgotten. When David married Susan at 27, he believed that chapter of his life was behind him. It was in 2010 when David's carefully constructed life began to unravel. On a crisp autumn afternoon, David received an unexpected letter from Emma. She had found his address through mutual family connections. The letter was vague but emotional, full of longing and regret. Emma claimed she wanted closure, to finally speak about their past and move on. David was hesitant, but couldn't ignore the pull of unfinished business. When they met at a diner on the outskirts of town, Emma was no longer the wild teenager he remembered. Now 33, she was striking, confident, and had an air of control that was both intimidating and alluring. She spoke about her struggles, failed relationships, a career that hadn't taken off, and a lingering sense of displacement from being the product of an affair. What began as an innocent meeting quickly shifted as they reminisced about their shared past. Emma leaned into the unresolved tension between them. David, despite his better judgment, found himself unable to resist. The affair was rekindled that a choice that would ripple through their lives with devastating consequences. For the next few months, David and Emma carried on their affair in secret. They met at motels outside town, careful not to leave any traces. Their relationship was intense, fueled by years of suppressed emotions and the thrill of the forbidden. But it was also tumultuous. Emma's manipulative tendencies began to surface. She demanded David's attention and grew jealous of the life he shared with Susan. David, on the other hand, was plagued by guilt. He loved Susan and their children deeply, but he couldn't sever the toxic bond he shared with Emma. Each time he promised himself it would be the last, Emma would pull him back in, playing on his weaknesses and their shared history. By early 2011, Susan began noticing changes in David. He started coming home late, citing extra shifts at work. He was distant, often lost in thought, and their once lively conversations became short and strained. On some nights, he would avoid her touch altogether, retreating to the garage after dinner. Susan's breaking point came on a rainy afternoon in March 2011. While doing laundry, she found a crumpled receipt in David's jean pocket. It was from a motel in a neighboring town, dated just a week prior. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Perhaps he had been there for work or to help a friend. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Over the next few days, Susan began to piece things together. She noticed the way David's phone buzzed at odd hours, and how he would step outside to take calls. One evening, while David was in the shower, Susan couldn't resist the urge to check his phone. What she found shattered her world. A string of messages from a woman named Emma Parker, some flirtatious, others explicitly detailing their meetings. On the night of March 20th, 2011, Susan confronted David. She waited until the children were asleep, then calmly placed his phone on the kitchen table open to the messages. David initially denied everything, insisting Emma was just an old family friend. But when Susan pressed him, her voice shaking with both anger and heartbreak, David's facade crumbled. He confessed to the affair, but left out the most shocking detail. It wasn't until Susan demanded to know how he knew Emma that David revealed the truth. Emma wasn't just his lover, she was his half-sister. Susan's reaction was one of disbelief and revulsion. She felt as though her entire marriage had been a lie, the man she thought she knew hiding something so dark and incomprehensible. Susan didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at photos of their family, trying to make sense of how David could betray her in such a way. By dawn, she had made a decision. She would expose the affair no matter the cost, believing that the truth needed to come out for her own peace and the safety of her family. What Susan couldn't foresee was the devastating chain of events her decision would set in motion. What would happen next? The answer was more horrifying than anyone could imagine. The Wallace family's collapse began on a Sunday evening in June 2011, in the living room of David Thompson and Susan's modest Texas home. Susan had spent weeks grappling with the weight of David's betrayal. She oscillated between rage and despair, unsure whether to keep the affair secret for the sake of their children or to expose the truth. Ultimately, her anger won out, fueled by Emma's increasing boldness. Emma had started leaving cryptic voicemails, almost taunting Susan, claiming she and David shared a bond that no one could break. Susan decided the truth couldn't remain buried. She called for a family meeting, inviting both her parents and David's, as well as Emma Parker herself. The meeting took place on a humid evening in the Wallace home, the air thick with tension. Even before anyone said a word, the children had been sent to Susan's sister's house for the night, unaware of the storm brewing within their family. As the family gathered, Susan laid everything bare. She spoke in a calm but deliberate tone, recounting the months of betrayal she had uncovered, and the horrifying truth about Emma and David's relationship. David sat in silence, his face pale, while Emma smirked defiantly, as if proud of the chaos she had sown. The revelation hit their parents like a tidal wave. David's mother, a proud woman who had spent decades ignoring the existence of Emma, broke down in tears. She was devastated not only by David's betrayal of Susan, but by the realization that her husband's infidelity had led to such a monstrous situation. David's father sat rigid, staring at the floor, his guilt for the family's fractured past written all over his face. Emma's mother, on the other hand, lashed out in anger. She blamed David for corrupting her daughter, refusing to acknowledge that Emma had willingly rekindled the affair. The room descended into chaos, voices overlapping, accusations flying. Emma, however, remained eerily calm. She claimed she and David were soulmates and that their relationship transcended morality or family ties. Her audacity left everyone stunned. In the days that followed, David made desperate attempts to salvage his marriage. He begged Susan for forgiveness, promising that he would cut ties with Emma forever. He even went so far as to block Emma's number and swear he would never see her again. But Susan's trust was shattered beyond repair. She couldn't erase the image of David and Emma together, or forget the betrayal of her vows. Susan turned to her family for support, spending long hours on the phone with her sister and parents. She began discussing separation, though the thought of breaking apart her family weighed heavily on her heart. The emotional turmoil consumed her. Nights were sleepless, her mind racing with thoughts of what had gone wrong, while days were filled with the exhausting task of pretending everything was fine for the sake of her children. Emma, meanwhile, refused to let David go. She became obsessed, convinced that Susan was the only thing standing in the way of her happiness. She began harassing Susan with calls, leaving messages laced with venom and threats. Sometimes the calls were pleading, begging Susan to step aside. Other times they were menacing, with Emma accusing Susan of being unworthy of David Thompson. The harassment didn't stop there. Lila started showing up uninvited, lingering outside the Wallace home. Neighbors noticed her car parked on the street at odd hours. Once, Susan spotted Lila standing at the edge of their driveway, staring at the house with an unsettling intensity. Despite David Thompson's attempts to cut her off, Lila found ways to insert herself into their lives, refusing to accept that he had chosen his family over her. By early 2012, Susan's fear began to grow. She started keeping the doors locked at all times and even considered filing a restraining order. But in the quiet moments, she questioned whether she was overreacting. After all, Lila hadn't physically harmed anyone yet. Still, the tension in the Wallace household was palpable. David Thompson was constantly on edge, torn between guilt and the fear of what Lila might do next, while Susan tried to hold herself together for the sake of her children. The morning of March 6, 2012 started like any other. Susan, now living in quiet defiance of the chaos swirling around her, had planned a day of errands and household chores. The children were at school, and the house was unusually still. But by midday, everything would change. At 10:42 a.m., a neighbor, Mrs. Albright, noticed something unusual. The front door of the Wallace home was ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Mrs. Albright, a retired teacher, thought it was odd, but didn't immediately investigate. It wasn't until 12:15 p.m., when Susan failed to pick up her youngest child from school, that alarms were raised. By 1:35 p.m., the police arrived at the Wallace home. The scene they discovered was horrifying. Susan's body was found in the living room, lying in a pool of blood. Her throat had been slit, and there were signs of a struggle, furniture overturned, broken glass scattered across the floor. The crime scene pointed to a crime of passion, the violence so personal it left no doubt that the killer had acted out of intense emotion. The police noted that the house had been ransacked, but nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. This wasn't a burglary, it was a targeted attack. Susan's phone, still on the kitchen counter, had several missed calls from an unknown number. By March 8, 2012, the police had begun piecing together the events leading up to the murder. David Thompson was questioned extensively. He provided an alibi, claiming he had been at work that morning, which was corroborated by his colleagues. However, his connection to Lila made him a person of interest. Attention quickly shifted to Lila. Neighbors reported seeing her car near the Wallace home in the days leading up to the murder, and several mentioned her erratic behavior in recent months. The police obtained a warrant to search her apartment, where they found troubling evidence: a notebook filled with obsessive writings about David Thompson, Susan, and their family. On March 12, 2012, the investigation took a dramatic turn. Lila Carter disappeared. Her apartment was left untouched, as if she had fled in a hurry. Her car was found abandoned near the Texas-Georgia state line later that evening, sparking fears that she was attempting to escape. The Wallace family's tragedy had shaken the small Texas town to its core. Susan's death, so sudden and violent, left her children orphaned in every sense. David Thompson, though alive, was a shell of his former self, consumed by guilt and the weight of his choices. And Lila, the woman who had once been part of their family, was now the prime suspect in a murder that would haunt them all forever. What would happen next was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The fallout from David Thompson and Lila's forbidden relationship had reached its horrifying conclusion. For 4 months, Lila Carter evaded law enforcement, slipping through their grasped like a shadow. Her disappearance on March 12, 2012, had sparked a nationwide manhunt, with her name and face plastered across every news outlet. Investigators uncovered evidence that she had been living off cash, using fake IDs, and moving frequently between small towns, always staying one step ahead of authorities. The break in the case came on July 20, 2012, when a Border Patrol agent at the Canadian border noticed a woman nervously waiting to cross. Her appearance was drastically altered. Her once vibrant auburn hair was now dyed a dull brown, and she had shed significant weight. But it was her eyes, haunted and restless, that gave her away. When her fake identification didn't pass scrutiny, Lila attempted to flee, bolting across the checkpoint. She didn't make it far. After a brief chase, she was tackled to the ground and subdued. In her bag, officers found a large sum of cash, a forged passport, and a journal filled with disturbing entries about David Thompson and Susan. Many of the entries described a fantasy of being reunited with David Thompson after Susan's removal. Lila was immediately extradited to Texas, where she was charged with first-degree murder. Her arrest was a relief to Susan's grieving family and a small, shaken community that had lived in fear of what she might do next. By early 2013, the trial of Lila Carter began, drawing national attention. It was held in the Travis County Courthouse, and the proceedings were dominated by a mix of somber reflection and heated emotion. The courtroom was packed every day with members of the community, eager to see justice served. The prosecution's case was strong, led by Assistant District Attorney Carolyn Weaver, a seasoned litigator known for her meticulous approach. Weaver painted Lila as a dangerous and manipulative woman whose obsession with David Thompson drove her to murder Susan in a jealous rage. She presented a timeline of events supported by damning evidence, text messages and voicemails from Lila to Susan, some of which contained veiled threats forensic evidence, including fingerprints and DNA. Linking Lila to the crime scene, a series of eyewitness accounts placing Lila near the Wallace home on the morning of March 6, 2012. Weaver also highlighted Lila's disturbing journal entries, which revealed a pattern of obsessive and delusional thinking. In these pages, Lila referred to herself as David Thompson's one true love and wrote about removing obstacles to their happiness. The defense, led by attorney Paul Grayson, argued that Lila's actions were the result of mental instability and emotional turmoil. Grayson claimed that her troubled upbringing and the toxic relationship with David Thompson had pushed her into a state of desperation. He tried to shift blame toward David Thompson, implying that his manipulation and deceit played a significant role in the events leading up to Susan's death. One of the most emotional moments of the trial came when David Thompson took the stand. His testimony was pivotal, not only for the prosecution's case but also as a moment of personal reckoning. David Thompson described his affair with Lila in excruciating detail, laying bare the extent of his betrayal and his guilt over what had happened to Susan. He spoke about the months leading up to the murder, how he had tried to cut ties with Lila but had underestimated the depth of her obsession. He portrayed Lila as manipulative and relentless, recounting how she had harassed Susan and refused to let go of their relationship. David Thompson's voice cracked as he expressed his remorse, not only for his infidelity, but for the role he believed it played in Susan's death. He stopped short of taking direct responsibility, insisting that he never imagined Lila would resort to violence. His testimony was a turning point in the trial, swaying the jury further toward conviction, but it also painted David Thompson as a deeply flawed and tragic figure, a man whose selfish decisions had destroyed the woman he loved and shattered the lives of his children. On March 15, 2013, after 2 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Lila Carter was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and subdued celebration. Susan's family, who had been present every day of the trial, wept openly as the verdict was read. During the sentencing on March 22, 2013, the judge delivered a scathing condemnation of Lila Carter's actions, calling the murder the ultimate betrayal of both family and humanity. Lila Carter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She remained stoic as the sentence was handed down, though her cold demeanor sent chills through the courtroom. In the aftermath of the trial, the community rallied around Susan's family, remembering her as a devoted mother and kind neighbor whose life had been cut short in the most brutal way. Her parents established the Susan Thompson Memorial Scholarship, aimed at helping women who had experienced betrayal and hardship rebuild their lives. Racked with guilt, David Thompson sold the family home and moved away with his children. He dedicated his life to raising them, vowing to teach them the importance of honesty and integrity. Though he would never fully forgive himself, he channeled his remorse into creating a better future for his kids. Lila's life behind bars became one of isolation and delusion. She refused to acknowledge her guilt, clinging to the belief that she and David Thompson were meant to be together. Her journal, confiscated during her arrest, revealed that even in prison she fantasized about their reunion. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more stories about betrayal, revenge, and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Click the bell icon so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Stay tuned for more real-life crime, tales that will leave you questioning the truth. And remember, the truth is always stranger than fiction. Make sure to check it out